The moment my brother slid the folder across the table and said, "We just need your signature," I felt something go cold in my chest. Not shock, not anger. Something quieter than that. Something that felt a lot like, finally. Let me back up. I'm 31 years old. I work in healthcare administration, which sounds boring until you realize it means I've spent the better part of a decade learning how to read contracts, audit billing records, and catch the kind of mistakes that cost hospitals millions of dollars. I'm good at details. I'm good at spotting when something doesn't add up. And for most of my adult life, I used that skill for everyone else except myself. My brother's name is Russell. He's 38, 7 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he's been the family's golden child. The firstborn son. The one my parents introduced at every holiday gathering with that particular tone of voice. The one that makes you feel like you're the footnote at the bottom of someone else's story. Russell started a contracting business in his late 20s. My parents co-signed a business loan for him. They helped him put a down payment on his first house. When the business struggled, they covered his payroll twice. I know, because I helped them transfer the money. I never asked for any of that. Not because I didn't need help sometimes, but because asking never felt like a real option. The help in our family flowed in one direction, and I'd understood that since I was about 14 years old. What I did instead was save aggressively. I kept my expenses low, drove the same car for 9 years, didn't take vacations I couldn't afford, and put every spare dollar into a brokerage account I opened myself at 23 with $150 and a YouTube tutorial about index funds. By the time I was 30, I had a little over $280,000 saved between my brokerage account and my Roth IRA. I also owned a small condo I bought at 27, which had appreciated enough that I had about $90,000 in equity at that point. Nobody in my family knew the exact numbers. They knew I was good with money. They knew I didn't have debt. But I kept the specifics private, the way you keep anything private when you've learned that information in your family is a resource that gets used. I should have kept it more private. That was my mistake. It started about 8 months before the dinner that changed everything. My sister-in-law, Russell's wife, her name is Deb, started asking me questions that felt casual but weren't. How's the condo? Did you refinance with the new rates? Do you max out your 401k? She asked these things the way people ask about the weather, slipped into other conversations, easy to brush off. I answered vaguely, but Deb is persistent in a way that looks like friendliness, and over the course of a few family dinners, I probably gave her more than I should have. Russell's business had been struggling again. I didn't know the details then, but I learned them later. He'd taken on a large commercial project, the kind that looked great on paper and then turned into a cash flow nightmare when the general contractor started delaying payments. He'd also expanded too fast. Hired more crew than he needed, bought equipment on credit. By the time I was getting those casual questions from Deb, Russell was about 4 months behind on a business line of credit and had burned through most of their personal savings. My parents knew. Of course they knew. They'd been quietly helping again, covering his minimum payments here and there. But this time, the hole was deeper, and their own retirement accounts were already thinner than they should have been after years of propping him up. Someone, and I still don't know exactly who had the idea first, decided that I was the solution. I found out about it the wrong way. My mom called me on a Tuesday night in February, and she was using the voice she uses when she wants something but hasn't figured out how to ask yet. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing. The weather in her town, a neighbor's dog, a recipe she'd seen. Then, right at the end, she said, "We were thinking it might be good for the family to get together soon. Nothing formal, just dinner." I said, "Sure, of course, I love my family." 3 days later, my dad texted me the address of a restaurant. Nice place. The kind with linen napkins and a Prex Fixie menu on weekends. My parents didn't go to places like that casually. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. Here's what I also did. I called my attorney. I should explain that I have an attorney, because about 2 years earlier, I'd gone through a minor legal situation involving a dispute with a contractor who'd done shoddy work on my condo. Nothing dramatic, but it meant I'd had to find a real estate and estates attorney, a woman named, well, I'll call her my attorney, and after that experience I kept her on a very occasional retainer for general advice. She was sharp, practical, and she never oversold anything. I called her the morning after my dad texted me the restaurant address. I told her about the questions Deb had been asking. I told her about my brother's business situation, what I knew of it. I told her something felt off and I didn't know what I was walking into. She asked me a few questions. Then she said something I've thought about many times since. She said, if you don't know what they want yet, find out before you show up. And if you do know, protect yourself before you walk in that door. I spent the next 4 days doing both. I called my cousin, who lives 2 states away and has exactly zero stake in my family's financial dynamics. She and Russell had never been close. I asked her if she'd heard anything, just family gossip, just the kind of thing that circulates. She was quiet for a second and then she said, "He's in real trouble, isn't he?" It wasn't a question. She'd heard something from her mom, my aunt, about Russell needing a big favor and my parents being very worried. That was enough. I went back to my attorney. We talked for an hour. She walked me through what I should and should not do before that dinner. She couldn't tell me for certain what my family was planning, but she could help me make sure that whatever it was, it would hit a wall. I moved approximately $210,000 from my standard brokerage account into a separate account at a different institution, one that was not linked to anything my family had ever seen or heard me mention. I did not close the original account. I left enough in it to look like my normal portfolio. I also had a brief conversation with my condo's title company to understand what my options were if anyone ever tried to pressure me into refinancing or signing something property-related under duress. Then I went to dinner. The restaurant was in the suburbs, about 40 minutes from where I live. I drove myself. I got there a few minutes early and sat at the table alone with a glass of water and watched my family walk in. My parents came in first. My mom hugged me a little too long. My dad patted my shoulder and said, "You look good, sweetheart," which is what he says when he's nervous. Then Russell came in with Deb, and behind them, to my genuine surprise, was my uncle, my dad's brother. He's a retired accountant, and he's always been the person my family calls when they want something to sound official. That told me a lot. We ordered. We made small talk. I ate my appetizer, and I kept my face very neutral, and I waited. My mom asked about my job. Deb asked about the condo. Russell talked about a project that had gone well last spring before the current trouble started, and I listened and nodded and said all the right things. The plates were cleared. My uncle ordered coffee, and then Russell leaned forward and said, "So, we actually wanted to talk to you about something." I put my hands in my lap. Okay. He talked for a while. He laid it out in the careful, measured way he'd clearly rehearsed. The business was having a cash flow problem. Temporary. He'd been through rough patches before and come out the other side. But right now he needed to consolidate some debt, and the best option, the one that would keep interest rates manageable and keep everything in the family, was a personal loan from me. $200,000. He'd pay it back over 5 years with a formal repayment schedule. My uncle had drafted something very professional, very above board. My dad said we wouldn't ask if we weren't sure he could pay it back. My mom said it would mean so much to this family. I looked at Deb. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilty. More like calculating. I said, "Can I see the paperwork?" My uncle slid the folder across the table. I opened it, I read it. Not skimming. Actually reading. I have a professional habit of reading documents the way other people don't, and I used it right there at the dinner table while my family watched me with the particular anxiety of people who'd prepared their best argument and weren't sure if it was going to land. The document was real. Notarized template, repayment schedule, everything formatted properly. My uncle knew what he was doing. But there was a clause buried in Section 4 that would have given Russell the right to defer payments for up to 18 months if he could demonstrate business hardship, which, given his current situation, he absolutely could. 18 months of no payments, and then I'd be the one in the position of deciding whether to enforce the loan against my own brother or write it off. I looked up. "I need some time to think about this," I said. Russell said, "How much time?" "A few days." My dad said we were kind of hoping. "A few days," I said again. Friendly, Calm, not a question. There was a silence that stretched too long. Then my uncle said, "Of course, that's reasonable." We finished coffee. We said our goodbyes in the parking lot. My mom hugged me again and said, "We love you, you know that." I said I knew. I drove home. I called my attorney that night from my car, still in my driveway. I told her everything I'd read in the document. She confirmed what I'd noticed about the deferral clause. She also pointed out two other things I'd missed. One related to how the repayment schedule interacted with Russell's business structure, and one that had to do with what would happen to the agreement if he declared bankruptcy, which was, at that point, genuinely possible. "So what do you want to do?" she asked. I thought about it. I thought about 20 years of watching money flow toward Russell and not toward me. I thought about my parents' retirement accounts and how thin they'd gotten and how none of that was my fault. I thought about Deb's questions over dinner after dinner after dinner, mapping out my finances like she was doing reconnaissance. "I'm going to say no," I said, "but I want to do it right." She helped me draft the response. We kept it short. No legal language that would put anyone on the defensive. Just clear. 2 days later, I called my parents, not Russell, my parents, and I told them I'd made my decision. I said I wasn't able to lend the money. I said I cared about Russell, and I hoped his business recovered. But I wasn't in a position to put $200,000 at risk, especially given the deferral clause in the agreement, which I named specifically so they'd know I had read it carefully. My mom went quiet. Then she said, "I didn't think you'd actually say no." I said, "I know." My dad got on the line. He was hurt. He said, "This is family." I said I understood that, and I also understood that the money I'd saved was my financial security and I'd worked a long time to build it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was just clear. Then things got complicated. Russell called me 2 hours later. He was not calm the way my parents had been. He was angry in the tight, pressurized way of someone who'd been counting on something he hadn't actually secured yet. He said I was being selfish. He said I had money sitting in accounts doing nothing while his family was struggling. He said, "You've never had to worry about anyone but yourself." I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "I've made my decision, Russell." He said, "Mom and Dad helped you plenty when you needed it." I almost laughed, not meanly, just because it was such a strange thing to say. I thought about all the years I'd watched them help him. The loans, the cosigns, the covered payroll. I thought about how the help they'd given me over my entire adult life could probably fit in an afternoon if you added it up honestly. I said, "I don't think that's true, but I'm not going to argue about it." He hung up. For the next 3 weeks, things were tense. My mom called me twice, not to fight, just to feel out whether I might change my mind. I was warm with her. I asked about her garden, her book club, the neighbor's dog again. I did not change my mind. Deb texted me once. She said she was surprised by my decision and hoped we could talk more. I replied that I hoped Russell's business situation improved and that I was rooting for them. That was all. My uncle called me once. He was professional about it, said he understood, mentioned that the offer was still on the table if I reconsidered. I thanked him. I did not reconsider. What I did instead was have 2 more conversations with my attorney, set up automatic contributions to max out my Roth IRA for the year, and open a high-yield savings account for a home renovation fund I'd been thinking about for a while. I also, for the first time in probably 10 years, took an actual vacation. 6 days in Sedona with a friend of mine, hiking and reading and not thinking about anyone's cash flow problems. It was the best week I'd had in years. When I got back, there was a voicemail from my dad. He said the business had reached a restructuring agreement with the lender. Not perfect, but workable. Russell had also taken on a smaller, steadier subcontracting arrangement to stabilize income while the larger project resolved. Things were looking better. My dad didn't apologize exactly, but at the end of the voicemail he said, "We should have handled this differently. I know that." I listened to it 3 times. Then I called him back and we talked for 40 minutes about almost nothing, the way we used to when I was younger, before the money stuff, before all of it became complicated. A few months later, I was at a birthday party for my cousin's daughter, and I ended up sitting next to my uncle for a while. He wasn't uncomfortable, which I respected. He said, "You read that clause, didn't you?" I said, "I read the whole thing." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Good, you should have." I've thought about that a lot since. He drafted the document, he knew what was in it, and when it came down to it, he told me I did the right thing by protecting myself. I don't know what to make of that entirely. Maybe he was relieved. Maybe he'd been the one in that room who knew the loan was a bad idea and didn't say so. Maybe he'd seen enough financial entanglements in his career to understand what I'd understood sitting at that table reading Section 4. Russell's business is still running. It's smaller now, more focused. He and Deb seem okay. We're not close, and I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon, but we're civil. We were civil at Thanksgiving. We'll probably be civil at Christmas. That's enough for now. My parents and I are better. Not perfect. I think there are things we all understand now that we didn't say out loud during any of this, and maybe that's fine. My mom asked me last month how my condo was coming along, and I told her about the renovation I'm finally doing, the kitchen update I've been putting off for 3 years. She asked if she could come see it when it's finished. I said yes, of course, I'd love that. I don't think about the $200,000 very much anymore. I think about the version of me that would have signed the paperwork, the one who would have said yes because saying no felt too hard, too disloyal, too much like admitting that the love in our family had always had conditions attached to it. I think about how close I came to being that version. And I think about my attorney's voice on the phone, practical and steady, saying, "Protect yourself before you walk in that door." I did. And everything that came after, the hard conversations, the cold silences, the slow and imperfect thaw, all of it was worth it, because the money is still mine. And more than that, for the first time in my adult life, I looked at my family clearly, without flinching, and I held my ground. That's not something anyone can take from you, not even the people who love you. I still think about the moment Russell slid that folder across the table. The way he said, "Just sign it," like it was nothing. Like $200,000 and the roof over my head were a minor inconvenience I was being dramatic about. What I've come to understand is that none of what happened was really about money. Money was just the surface. Underneath it was something older. The assumption that I would say yes because I always had, in smaller ways, for a long time. The assumption that love meant having no limits. And I think that assumption had been building for years, fed every time I stayed quiet, every time I let something slide, every time I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But here's the thing about cause and effect that nobody talks about honestly. The moments that break a pattern aren't dramatic. They don't feel like turning points when you're in them. I didn't have some revelation sitting at that dinner table. I just read Section 4. I just made one phone call the morning after I got suspicious. I just decided, very quietly, that I was going to protect myself before I walked in that door. One small, unglamorous choice, and everything else followed from that. That's what I mean when I think about integrity now. Not the big speeches, not the dramatic confrontations. Integrity is reading the whole document when everyone at the table expects you to just sign it. It's knowing your own numbers well enough that nobody can rewrite your story for you. It's not because you're suspicious of people you love, but because being honest with yourself is the foundation of being honest with anyone else. I wasn't dishonest with Russell. I was clear. There's a difference. The intelligence piece, and I don't mean being smart in the academic sense, I mean the practical, eyes-open kind that took years to build. I opened a brokerage account at 23 with $150 and a YouTube video. I made small decisions consistently for almost a decade, and when the moment came that actually mattered, I had options. That's what preparation actually does. It doesn't prevent hard moments. It means that when hard moments arrive, you're not scrambling. You're already standing on ground you built yourself. And then there's the part that was hardest for me, staying steady when the people I loved were angry. Russell hung up on me. My mom asked twice if I'd reconsider. There were 3 weeks of silence that felt like the walls of my childhood closing in. I didn't enjoy any of it. I didn't feel righteous. I just held the line and waited, because I knew that if I folded under pressure, it wouldn't be the last time someone applied it. That's the thing about resilience. It's not toughness for its own sake. It's just refusing to make a permanent decision based on a temporary discomfort. The discomfort of saying no to my family was real, and it lasted weeks. But the alternative was a document that could have unraveled everything I'd spent a decade building. My uncle said it best, without meaning to. He drafted the paperwork. He knew what was in it. And at a birthday party months later, he looked at me and said, "Good, you should have." Even the people who were part of the plan respected the outcome. That tells you something about what people actually value underneath everything else. The money is still mine. The relationships, imperfect, slow-thawing, real, are still there too. Not everything was lost. Just the version of me who would have signed.